Alright, so we're going to get into theories of leadership for this video. So this part is going to be the history and theories of leadership. The next video is also more theories of leadership. So this one is older theories, original theories, and then the next one is more modern developments, versions. So I definitely, recommend trying to keep them straight. I know it's a lot, but I also recommend, and if you haven't been doing this already, I really recommend not trying to watch all of my lecture videos in a row, doing maybe one a day, um, taking some time between them because it can be just a lot. And when I record them, I feel like it's a lot. So I'm going to get in right now to the history and theories of leadership. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So, history of leadership. Originally, we had a list of different types of theories that people would take. So here are some of them. Pull this all up. So basically, for this lecture, I'm just going to cover these ones here. So everything above that line. Let me actually draw on it. So this lecture is going to cover all of this stuff. Great man, great woman theories, the trait approach, the behavioral approach, these two very influential studies, and the contingency approach briefly. And then the next video will be this one, which will also, it's separate, even though it seems like it's only one thing, but that's because there's a lot to it, and it's the stuff that I would really want you to know better, some of the main modern theories of leadership. So let's move forward, shall we? So some of the very first leadership theories were known as the great man theories. And of course, there we go, using a masculine term to describe leadership. That's how you know it's old, and just kind of an original development of an idea. But it was specifically kind of taking that trait approach, but really focusing on the lives of well-respected leaders who, of course, were almost entirely men. And they looked for, traits and trends and clues and things about that person that were kind of like indicators of why this leader was so great. And it usually focuses on admirable traits of the leaders. And I also think it maybe overemphasized greatness of certain people. But some examples of some of the people that I looked at, and I'm not saying these people were great, a lot of them are amazing, but it definitely focuses on their admirable traits. But here are some people that might have been looked at, and I tried to include, different races and genders in this one. But truthfully, a lot of this approach tend to focus on, again, like I mentioned in the previous video, famous white male leaders are often the focus of these theories, especially originally. But most of this work was done outside of IO psychology. So historians, anthropologists, sociologists, communication experts who are looking at speeches and things like that, they're the ones who really focused on this type of way of examining things. And this, of course, if you remember the difference between quantitative data and qualitative data, is a primary qualitative approach because you're not using numbers, you're using, words and kind of just trying to gather things from them. So this was one of the first ways of maybe looking at leadership. And then from there, something I've kind of talked about as well is this trait approach. And it attempts to show that leaders possess certain characteristics that the non-leaders don't have. So this is kind of in conjunction with the leader emergence stuff from the last video. And there are two primary methods of studying it. One is, of course, leader emergence method, which I talked about, who is emerging as a leader from a group, and what traits do they have, and then also formal leader method. So which leaders are more effective and what traits do they have? So rather than just saying, here's a group who emerges as a leader, it's saying, let's look at all of these different groups, all of which had leaders designated, and of these groups, which of the designated leaders are the most effective, and what traits do they have? So some of these commonly studied characteristics, as I've talked about, are things like their personality, which includes 5, their intelligence and cognitive ability, which we, of course, see relating to a lot of things: the leader's confidence, their masculinity or gender, their age, politics, and things like weight and height. If you guys didn't know, one interesting finding is that every US president who has won an election since the invention of like television, where you can see them in debates, has been the taller of the two candidates, with the exception of George W. Bush, I believe, when he was running against John Kerry. And I think that's interesting to note because height is weirdly associated with success in men specifically. If you look into research on, biases based on appearances, we see a lot of discrimination against women based on their looks and how much they weigh. And those biases don't tend to emerge for men, but they do emerge for men only for the area of height. So height is something that men are discriminated against for. And of course, since many of our leaders are men, or our famous leaders at least are men, we see that a lot. And it's actually really interesting to note that people, judge on such a superficial level, but that's what we do. We see something and we, make our judgment based on that. Oh, that person's tall, therefore they must be a good leader. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, I don't know if you guys remember this, but when I was a kid, there was that show Invader Zim where the leaders of the alien race were just the tallest, and they literally refer to them as the tallest. And it's a joke because those two leaders were actually really stupid, but it's not really a joke because we actually do that, and it's kind of embarrassing. But I digress a bit. So moving on from the trait approach, where hopefully we're looking at traits that actually matter, like personality, intelligence, ability, and other things like that. Unfortunately, we look at some other things that don't matter, like height. But moving on from the trait approach to the behavioral approach, this focuses on what types of behavior are the people in leadership roles engaging in. So rather than just what traits do they have, are they smart, are they outgoing, it's what are they doing as the leader. This is based on two major studies conducted by Ohio State University and the University of Michigan. So the Ohio State studies, this one specifically went like this. So first they developed 1,800 items, meaning kind of like questions that they could ask on leader behaviors, like I frequently engage in feedback with my subordinate type of item. After eliminating several items, the remaining were classified into 10 broad categories. Questionnaires were distributed to tons of leaders in a ton of different areas and asked how frequently they engaged in the behavior. So they would be like, kind of that example I said, I give feedback to my employees, and then they would respond, oh, I, on a scale of 1 to 5, very frequently every day, to 1 where it's like, never. After running all of the results from these questionnaires through what's called a factor analysis, which is where kind of the statistical software itself kind of shows you how things kind of fall. It's kind of hard to explain simply, but what it does is basically take all of your items and put them into factors. And while this originally, they, just based off kind of their theories, they classified it in 10 categories. What emerged from the factor analysis was 2 categories. And these 2 categories are consideration, or they were later labeled consideration, which includes behaviors indicating mutual trust, respect, and a sort of warmth and rapport between the supervisors and followers. And then initiating structure, which includes behavior in which the supervisor organizes and defines the group activities and his or her relation to the group. You can almost think of these things in terms of kind of one factor being relational and the other factor being task-oriented. And of course, both of these things matter a lot in leadership, and we tend to often consider these things as if they're opposites. Someone who's good at relationships maybe not as good as tasks, and vice versa. But a leader is someone who's able to, do both of these things with their subordinates effectively, based on this study. The other study was the University of Michigan studies, which occurred simultaneously at the same time as the Ohio State studies did. And it focused on how the leaders interacted with their subordinates. So maybe that relational side. And they used the same process type of method that I described for the Ohio studies. They ultimately identified 3 categories of behaviors. So the task-oriented, which is practically the same thing as initiating structure, relationship-oriented behaviors, which is the same thing as consideration, like I mentioned. But they had one more, and that was the participative behavior, which includes leader behavior that allows subordinates more participation in decision making. It encourages more two-way communication. So this is becoming more of the leader allowing for the followers to be a part of the leadership process. So, sorry, there's probably like a little pause there. My husband just walked in while I was in the middle of this recording, which is, part of the joy of working from home. So I was saying that these are the 3 categories of behavior that came from the Michigan studies, two of which were similar to the Ohio State studies, and those 2, the task and relationship-oriented behaviors, are the most common of leadership behaviors. And they found that relationship-oriented behaviors lead to increased follower satisfaction, increases in follower motivation, and increases in leader effectiveness, at least as rated by the followers. And task-oriented behavior increased follower performance, increased leader performance, and increased unit and group performance. So, you could use both of these effectively, and they would be both equally important because you want, relationship-oriented behavior to motivate and satisfy your followers so the group is cohesive, stays together, wants to work together, and then the task-oriented behaviors will help you just get the job done. So that's it for the behavioral approach. The next is the contingency approach, and this one's a little bit hard to explain. I cut a lot of stuff out because there was just a lot of detail in it. So I'm going to go through it briefly just to give you a broad idea of what it consists of, but it's not super important right now. So the thing that does make the contingency approach important, though, is that unlike the trait and behavior approaches, it chooses not to focus only on the leader as the sole source of leadership. And if you remember, the behavioral approach from the Michigan study did kind of talk about the dynamic between the leader and the follower as kind of a factor as well. But the contingency approach takes that one step further, where it considers an impact of more contextual factors, such as the work environment itself or the situation in which the leadership is occurring. And there's a few examples of this. Hersey and Blanchard situational theory was one which talks about the leadership being a function of the subordinate's maturity. So it's important. The contextual factor that it takes into account is more the followers rather than anything else. So one thing it talks about is job maturity. So that means they're the followers' KSAs, if you remember, knowledge, skills, abilities that are related to the jobs and the task, as well as just general psychological maturity. So how confident are they, and what kind of self-respect do they have? Another example that I have a little bit more detail on is the Vroom-Yetton model, which talks about the benefits of participative leadership. Going back to what I just mentioned in the behavioral approach, being more participative with the followers, they're saying the research shows will increase follower satisfaction and motivation, just like the relationship-oriented behaviors, but it also results in enhanced communication and reduced pressure from the followers to just accept decisions blindly. And so this model is essentially like an algorithm and a series of questions that you can ask yourself as a leader to kind of come to the best solution for a problem. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And there's a number of solutions. The autocratic solution, where the leader collects information and solves the problem by themselves. Consultative, where you collect input from everyone but ultimately solve the problem as a leader by yourself. Group solution, which you share the problem with subordinate and find a joint solution with them. And delegative, where you share the problem and provide them with the resources to solve the problem on their own. And that's one way of putting it. The other ways that it can be described are in this model here. I'm not going to go through it piece by piece because that would take too long, but if you have time, go ahead and look through the slides. Look at these questions you might ask yourself and follow where you lead. So I'll go through one. So let's say I'm making a decision. Is the quality of this decision important? Let's go say yes. Is team commitment important for the decision? Yes, it is. And maybe it's a major change in the organization. Do you have enough information to make the decision on your own? No, I don't. I need some input. Is the problem well structure? No, it's not that. Would the team support your decision if you made it alone? Let's say, yeah, they would. So that stops me here at C2, which is the second consultative response. So in this case, I would consult the team members to seek their opinions and suggestions, but ultimately make the decision. In this type of leadership style, I'm open to suggestions and ideas, but at the end of the day, I am the one who makes the final call. So that's kind of how it works. Hopefully, as a leader, you wouldn't necessarily be dragging your finger down this chart with every decision you make, but it's cool to have kind of as an example of how a flowchart might work in this situation and what possible outcomes you can use that fit the decision you're trying to make based on dichotomous questions around. So I'm going to stop there for this one, and we'll get into some more modern theories as I talked about in the next video.